So Frances Haugen is an advocate for accountability and transparency in social media. She's a data scientist, and she was recruited by Facebook in 2019 for their civic misinformation team. And while she was at Facebook, she became increasingly alarmed by the choices the company was making to prioritize profit over public safety. So she blew the whistle on Facebook, and her revelations became known as the Facebook Files in 2021. Since then, Frances has testified in front of the US Congress, the UK and EU parliaments, the French Senate, their National Assembly. So she's engaged with lawmakers internationally to figure out how to best address the negative effects of social media platforms. And last month, Frances just joined the Center for Media Technology and Democracy as a senior fellow in residence, where she's going to be supporting its research and public engagement on online safety policy, youth digital rights, and data transparency, and which is why she's here. Taylor Owen is the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications and the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, and an associate professor in the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. He is also the host of the Big Tech podcast, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, a fellow at the Public Policy Forum, and he sits on the Governing Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Councils, SSHRC. In other words, you're about to listen to a couple of lightweights. So here's what we're going to do. Frances is going to give us a presentation for about 10 minutes. Then Frances and Taylor are going to chat for about half an hour. And then they're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So on that note, I want to let you know that we're not auditioning for speakers for next season. So please ask a question and keep it very short. Nobody really likes rambling comments at all. Anyway, Frances, take it away.
Good evening. Thank you guys for inviting me. I always like to start out and just check in on whether or not people use social media, because there's such a huge diversity. So how many of you in the last week used Facebook?
No
okay. Yeah. How many of you used Twitter? It's okay. How about TikTok? Anyone? Be Real. Any Be Real users? Oh, we got a few Be Real users. Okay, good. I'm always just curious, checking in, because all these platforms have similar issues and they all have their own issues. And so it's always good to know, like, what conversation are we having? So as Jorge said, my name is Frances Haugen, and I am an algorithmic product manager. So products, in a physical sense, are things like this phone or this microphone or this podium. They're things that are manufactured with a set purpose. When it comes to software, we have people who design software products. So Instagram is a product. Your search bar on Google is a product. But even a thing like just the box where you reshare a post on Instagram is itself a product. For almost 15 years, I worked at some of the largest tech companies in Silicon Valley on algorithms, basically collections of math as experiences for users. So I started out at Google working on search quality, and specifically on books. So I used to joke that I was the greatest librarian in the world, because I worked on how do you retrieve information from books, and we had the largest collection of digital books in the world. I worked at Pinterest on the home feed on something called a recommender system. So that's how do we find the pins in Pinterest, and then how do we show them to you? And eventually I ended up at Facebook. At Facebook, I came in thinking I was going to work on misinformation in the US 2020 election. It was the summer of 2019. They were recruiting for a civic product manager, their first person with that role. And I was like, of course, like that must be why they're doing this right now. And I showed up and realized that what I thought was the problem with Facebook was a tiny, tiny sliver of what was going on. I speak English. I assume because you're listening to me, you speak English. You likely use the social media that you use, if you use it, in English. And the reality is the English language version of Facebook is the cleanest, safest version of Facebook in the world. That for things like misinformation, Facebook was spending 89% of their operational budget on misinformation in English, even though only about 9% of users spoke English. Think about that for a moment. Why would you do that? Right? Why? Why would you have such a giant asymmetry? The reality is that Facebook knew that if people were aware of how dangerous its products were and what the actual experience was like of using these things in some of the most fragile places in the world, we would demand action. Even for a moment, if you look at where they spent their safety money between Facebook and Instagram, you begin to see interesting patterns. For many, many different safety systems, the safety system would exist for Facebook, but be missing on Instagram. Why would you do that? Well, not very many 16-year-olds vote, you know? Today, what I work on is pushing for social media transparency and accountability. Because for every physical product that you get a chance to buy or interact with, we have product safety standards. We have rules about how things can be manufactured, about what needs to be disclosed. Where I came from in California, if you have a known carcinogen in your product, you have to disclose that. If you put trans fats in your food, you have to disclose that. We have found that when we can see what goes into making the things that we interact with, the things in our lives, the people who make those products for us act much, much more responsibly. I joined the center at McGill because I believe we are in a very interesting moment. How many of you saw the announcement from the Surgeon General last week in the United States? So for context for folks, since the 1950s, there have been about 15 times the US Surgeon General has come out and said, there is a public health issue, maybe even 10 times, as few as 10 times, there is a public health issue that is being unaddressed, that is so serious that I need to come out and kind of set the table and say, we need to address that. So it was cigarettes. Cigarettes cause cancer, like 1960s. Seat belts are important. You need, car crashes are killing people. Cancer, childhood obesity, breastfeeding. These are not minor issues. These are things that today we would all say, yes, seat belts save lives. Cancer prevention is important for saving lives. Last week, the Surgeon General came out and said, there is enough research in now that we must have a public conversation about childhood mental health and the role of social media, right? There's a sentence, social media is harmful for kids, tech companies are not responding on their own, and we will have to do something. And the period at the end of that sentence is that announcement. And part of why I'm so grateful to be at McGill is the most important public debate we are going to have in the next 15 years, 20 years, we are going to have in the next 3 years. It's going to happen in Canada, it's going to happen in the United States, it's going to happen internationally. Because historically, whenever the Surgeon General has come out and made a statement like that, some kind of action follows. We start passing laws around you have to wear seatbelts. We start doing things like saying we have to disclose these risks on cigarettes. Something happens. And the public debate we're going to have is, what is that action? And the reason why I'm so excited to be working with McGill is I'm a little scared about what's being discussed right now. Recently in Utah, they passed a law basically getting rid of privacy for children online. Kids can no longer freely browse the internet, according to the Utah law. In Montana, they came out and said, we're going to ban TikTok, just straight up ban it. We have a choice in front of us. We can either pass sensible, moderate laws, things like what Europe passed last year. Basically, think of it as nutritional labeling on social media. Let's unlock the ability to challenge these platforms by demanding they show us what's going on. Start disclosing what the harms are they know about. Start saying, hey, if we ask you a question, you can't ignore us anymore. That's been the default arrangement for 20 years. These are the kinds of things that unlock what I call the ecosystem of accountability. You can start to do lawsuits. You can start to do boycotts. You can start to do divestment if you have real information. These laws can be transformative. Or we can choose a China-like approach. The real question we're now facing is, society always accepts a certain number of kids being harmed on any given issue. And we are starting to reach that number of kids. And so I hope you join with us in the next year as we start saying, let's bring a moderate bill forward, because there is a huge opportunity for Canada not to just begin to lead again on tech policy, but to influence other countries in having a moderate democratic approach forward. And I'm so excited to be part of that, along with Taylor and the rest. So thank you. Okay.
So this is the first, so Frances, we've been collaborating in various ways for a little bit, but this is the first sort of event we've done since she officially sort of is partnering with our center. And when she started, we were talking about doing events across Canada, and she was like, we should do a whistle-stop tour via train across the country. One, the distances may be like a little harsh, and two, we'd have to be on via rail across the country. So we're doing it a little bit more targeted, so this is one of our first targeted ones across the country. The odds of it making it across the country are very, very slim. So.
And you have to start small, and you figure out what lands and what doesn't land, and then you innovate.
Exactly. So the first of many. So what I want to start with is, so as someone who studies the problems that were revealed through the files, the Facebook files, the thing that really struck me that was why they were so powerful is not just because of the harms that they revealed. I think we had a decent sense from people who study this ecosystem, who study these problems, but what it really revealed was how much they knew internally about those harms. Because there were people outside of the companies screaming and yelling and studying for a decade, calling out these harms, but they were always denied by the company. So to me, that's like the real powerful thing that happened when these files were released. Can you talk a little bit about what did the company know was happening internally that you then...
So Taylor, I think you're actually falling for one of the traps that I see over and over again amongst, we are obsessive nerds when it comes to tech policy. Like, we sit and we very excitedly Zoom with each other and talk about this stuff. And tech journalists do the exact same thing. But it's one of the things I'm really shocked by is we can sometimes lose track of the fact that not everyone is coming on the same conversation with us. And so I just want to make sure that we're checking in on this, which is some of the stuff that was revealed was things like Facebook knew there was human trafficking going on, and the employees cared more about offending the buyers than stopping people from getting trafficked in. Right? And literally the comms people, when they got called for comment, were like, there's no way a Facebook employee would have done this. And Jeff guided them towards what they should go check, and they never objected again, right? Or they knew in the case of kids' mental health, a third of kids were saying, Instagram makes my body image issues significantly worse. Or kids talked about how bullying or obsessive use, right, compulsive use, feeling like you can't stop, how prevalent that was on the platform. And so the spectrum of problems was huge. We're talking about cartels using it to recruit members and openly operating in Mexico. So huge scale. And I think what it really, one of the things that changed the conversation was other people had come forward before with documents. I was a history minor, and not a lot of tech people have a history context. And I spent a lot of time in archives, actually, in college, because I did a thesis on, I was a Cold War studies person, and I got all the comment threads. So on every single document, I got the contemporaneous conversation. And I think that's the thing where people were shocked, was they got to watch the sausage being made. And you could see the frustration from individual employees saying, we have to do something, and being unable to move the ball down the field.
So talk a little bit more about that conversation, because that was really powerful too, because it wasn't just, to be clear, documents about harms they knew existed. It was conversations amongst people who worked at the company underneath those documents, discussing the trade-offs.
Yeah.
So what were some of the trade-offs you were wrestling with there?
So one of the things that made things frustrating was Facebook was a company that believed that if they could set the right goal metrics, ooh, with a little excitement there. Ooh, very good, very good. If they set the right goal metrics, that they could let anyone do whatever they wanted, and as long as they were pushing the ball down the field. Ignoring the fact that metrics always have biases in them. They can only capture a certain level of complexity. And because there was no explicit value on the harms, people were told, figure out a way to reduce the harms that doesn't ever move down how much money we make, or never decreases how many times someone opens the site, or how much time they spend, or how much they engage with other people. And there are amazing documents that talk about the frustration here, because if you were willing to say 10% of misinformation is worth 0.1% of profit, there's a lot of things that become possible. And because the almost explicit policy was like, no, if you hurt these engagement metrics, you cannot accept 10, 20% reductions in harms. It really burnt out employees, and I think it's a trade-off that no one who was standing on the outside would ever have said that's the appropriate trade-off.
You've worked in a number of companies in Silicon Valley. How generalizable do you think those problems are across other companies?
That is a great question. So I have a book coming out this summer called The Power of One, and the core arc that I try to lay out across the book is it's important for you to understand how a recommender system, so that's the kind of technology that powers your newsfeed, that powers the Twitter home feed, that powers your TikTok feed, how is that different than, say, Google search results? And because your experience on TikTok, your experience on Facebook, your experience on Twitter is personalized, it's very, very hard to actually hold those systems accountable. So when it comes to Google, I could sit almost anyone down in this room, and I know you don't believe me, but this is true. If you gave me 3 weeks and we worked on it together, I could teach you how to analyze the results on Google. Like, I can teach you enough code in 3 weeks, and we can pull down the stuff. You could actually start asking questions about Google. That's a low barrier to entry. If we wanted to do the same thing about Facebook, we would have to go, and because the experience for every person on Facebook is so different, we would have to recruit tens of thousands of people to put little pieces of software on their computers and basically copy their experiences down to be able to ask the same kind of questions. It's orders of magnitude harder. And I think that's one of these things where all people, when they get to grade their own homework, things slide over time. We all do best when we have a certain amount of accountability. And so I think that it is a very repeatable experience across Facebook, across Pinterest, across TikTok, places that are these recommender-based technologies. It's less so across technologies that are less opaque.
So since you went public with all of this, you've been traveling around the world. And right in a moment when governments are wrestling with this very problem, what do they... I would argue they're wrestling with it too late, but they're finally starting to do things.
Yeah.
And there's a host of ways. These problems are so vast, these technologies affect so many aspects of our lives. There's many ways you can come at it from a governance perspective. Who do you see getting it right in the world, or most right, that we should be looking to as models?
So I think one of the things that makes people think that they don't have options is we don't see a lot of movement in the world. When we look at the big movers before, say, 2 years ago, really the only big mover was China. So China came in and said, oh, no, the internet is very dangerous for social stability. We're going to control it. Like, we're going to tell you what you can say. We're going to have large blacklists. We're going to have tens of thousands, if not hundreds, like 100,000 moderators who will very actively police everything that's said. And the few countries that were acting beyond China seemed to be using the same playbook. It was, Germany has a law that doesn't regulate very many things, but it does relate to things like pro-Nazi content. And it took a very similar approach. It said, we're going to ban a bunch of things that you can say. Or Australia took a similar approach with regard to a few issues, same kind of thing, and similarly said, we're gonna take down what you can say. Only in like the last year or so have we started to see another kind of pole emerge, which is out of the European Union. So this is something called the Digital Services Act, which says we need to take a risk-based approach that says, hey, you're working from behind a curtain. We don't know what's happening on your platforms. You need to tell us what harms you know about. You need to have a positive obligation to disclose. If we ask you about a harm you don't disclose, you need to answer us honestly. And you need to give us plans on how you're going to try to drive down those risks. Mitigate the harm, figure out ways of preventing the harm. And these kinds of strategies are really good because they are based on systems. They're based on systematic risk. I think the UK is doing a good job with kids. They're doing a very similar thing, saying, hey, for any product, even that podium, if you sell a product and you think a kid is going to interact with it, you need to at least show you've thought about the risks to a child. The UK has modeled that for social media. I think those kinds of approaches, which is the same thing the expert panel in Canada came up with in the last couple of years, I think that's the kind of cutting edge path forward.
So how would the instinct of governments, and I think of citizens who use these technologies, it really is just, if there is Nazi content, or if there's child abuse content, or if there's hate speech, why wouldn't we just force the companies to take it down? A risk-based approach, it's harder to grasp how that would play out on a day-to-day basis to our experience on the internet. So if something like the Digital Services Act in the UK, or in Europe, was in place when you were at Facebook, how would that have changed some of those decisions that were made about prioritizing profit margins over protecting a kid? Like, how could that expally tangibly change?
So so it's interesting. So for things like child exploitative imagery, so people taking pictures of kids, that's like it's one of those weird outliers where like it's such a narrow space that you can actually do it. But for most of the things where if we were going to talk about these are the problems of social media, they're so much more amorphous and ambiguous that it's a lot harder. Like, what does it mean to say have hate speech, right? Like, humans are very, very bad at language discrimination tasks. Like, if I took two sentences that meant basically the same thing, and I polled the audience and I said, do these two sentences mean the same thing? We would only have 90% agreement. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. Like, that's about the simplest classification task we can do, and that's about as good as humans get. If we started talking about things like hate speech, we end up in this trade-off situation where it's like, if we at Facebook, we could only get about 5% of the hate speech if we were willing to accept a 10% error in taking down good stuff. Think about that. You're only taking down like 5% of the bad stuff. Like, if you want to take down 75% of the bad stuff or 80% of the bad stuff, you have to accept you're going to be wrong half the time. So content moderation approaches are not very strong. But then that means, well, what else can we use, right? And what we find is things like, Facebook ran a study where they said, imagine you divided all the content on Facebook into two pools. You have content you consented to, and you have content you didn't consent to. So content you consented to is you friended that person, you followed that page, you joined that group. And then there's stuff like someone invited you to a group, and for 30 days, Facebook gave you that content, and you wrote a comment on something saying that's misinformation. And Facebook was like, oh, you interacted with it, you must like it. And they put you in that group. Or it's your friend put a comment on something, and now that content goes into your feed. You never asked for it, but your friend engaged with it. If you just give priority to content you asked for, you get less hate speech, less violence, and less nudity. Right? Your friends and family are not the problem. It's the algorithm and the distribution mechanisms that's the problem. But Facebook keeps that in place today because you stay on the platform longer. It's a little bit more entertaining when the algorithms pick out the content like that. Like, some of the stuff that you're choosing is kind of boring from a retention perspective, even if it's what you chose. In a world where there was a countervailing cost to hate speech, they'd go, we're going to make 0.1% less money, 0.2% less money by respecting your wishes first. But we're not going to get fined. Like, we're going to be using the tools we have to drive down the amount of hate speech on the platform.
How much will they make less under the DSA? Yeah.
Do
you have any sense of how much is actually going to cost to do it,
I think
to be
there's
safe?
This interesting trade-off of long-term and short-term success. So Facebook has run the studies, and on a long-term basis, if they expose you to more bad stuff, and by bad stuff I mean violence, hate speech, nudity, stuff that's genuinely like distasteful, the chance that you'll still use the product in 6 months or a year is less. But all those are long-term costs. They're not short-term costs. And in a company that is governed by experiments, the long-term costs are invisible because they don't show up in the 4 weeks to 6 weeks that they run the experiment, right? And so I think it's one of these things where it puts a seat at the table for long-term success. And that's my hope.
So I want to talk a little bit about Canada and what we should do. What's the Canadian opportunity at this moment?
I also would say there's probably a number of people in this room who don't use Facebook anymore who would still be using Facebook if the Facebook of 2012 was still around. Right? That all those little aggregate choices added together into a product that people were no longer comfortable with. Sorry.
Back to Canada. So what's the opportunity at the moment? We've been pretty late to this conversation. Other countries have moved further and faster. Not the US, but others have. Australia, you mentioned, Germany,
we have a vintage
UK.
constitution.
That is true. What should we be doing, and what's the opportunity for Canada?
So I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada on a bunch of different levels. There's like the opportunity for Canada itself, which is having a seat at the table is better than not having a seat at the table. And currently, Facebook has a 15-plus year tradition now of just not answering questions. Right, the Canadian government has asked very basic things like how many moderators speak French, right? How many moderators are allocated to French-Canadian French? And they just won't answer them. They won't answer very basic questions because they'd have to spend more money, right, if people knew how negligent they were. Things, really basic things like how many kids are getting contacted by adults they don't know. Right? These are not rocket science questions. We're not asking them to have to go put research teams for months and months to answer complicated things. We're talking about bare bottom, kind of like, let's get a seat at the table. But the secondary thing is, I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada's international leadership. Because like I said before, we are in a moment where we will be setting future courses for humanity over the next 10 years. Because the number of kids who have been harmed is tiptoeing towards a line. We don't know exactly where the line is, but we are approaching the point where we are going to make emotional decisions, right? We don't get to choose when this kind of train stops unless we redirect it. And Canada has a history of leading coalitions, of leading other mid-sized countries and smaller countries and providing leadership to pass progressive laws. And I think there's an opportunity where if Canada can kind of get up to the point where the DSA is, there's an opportunity to begin building a diverse coalition that is not the US, that is not Europe, that can speak for places that are more linguistically diverse.
It's interesting you say the word progressive, because one of the real challenges we have here, so Canada has been developing this sort of approach to model broadly after what the Europeans have done. But one of the interesting political dynamics here at the moment is that it's being proposed by a progressive or liberal government rather than a conservative government, which is the case in the UK, it's the case in Australia. But these are often law in many US states, right? Utah and Montana. These are often states that are conservative. And one of the implications of that here is that the entire opposition to this bill is that it's going to curtail free speech. That was present in other countries, but wasn't dominant because it was sort of within the conservative parties that were promoting it. Here, it is the central narrative, and we have a Conservative Party leader who's going to run an election against these kinds of policies curtailing speech. How do you address this sort of free speech tension here? Is this really about free speech, or how do we?
Part of why I'm such a strong. So you can roll back in time and go watch my original Senate testimony. I am extremely clear on content moderation-based safety strategies do not work. Like, period. Right? Like, remember how we talked about before? Like, we can only get 90% agreement in this room on something as simple as, do these sentences say the same thing? Like, content moderation, like, we want to make AIs be brilliant. AI is, decades away from being able to have the level of nuance to be able to say, yes, this is hate speech, right? That can sound really confusing when we have things like chatbots that can write us, Shakespearean sonnets. But in reality, that classification issue and being able to understand the nuance of like, why is this harmful? Why is this is very hard, especially when you need to do it at the scale that a social network does. The cost for that Shakespearean sonnet is actually pennies. Like it's not cheap compared to like what you need to have the systems that run social networks do. But the secondary thing is right now we are all being censored by these systems in opaque ways. Like Facebook has a 2-sentence, 3-sentence thing saying this is what hate speech is on their website. They have a 30-page manual, 50-page manual describing what hate speech is behind the scenes. We need to be demanding laws that let us inspect those systems. Like if you care about freedom of speech, you should demand that we have transparency on these systems. The second is the kinds of solutions that are scalable are ones that are linguistically neutral. So I'll give you an example. If you come in and say, hey, let's say Alice writes something and lands in her friend Bob's newsfeed. And Bob's like, I'm going to reshare this. And it lands in Carol's newsfeed. So now it's 2 hops away from Alice. And now Carol reshared it and lands in Dan's newsfeed. Dan and Alice are more than friends of friends away from each other. He doesn't know who she is. She could be an expert. She could be a conspiracy theorist. He doesn't know. If all we do is gray out the reshare button for Dan and say, hey, Dan, you can say whatever you want. You want to reshare it? You can reshare this. But you're going to have to choose to. It can't be a reflex. You have to copy and paste and put it in the share box. That little change, like adding a little bit of reflection into the loop, has the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking program at Facebook. It's huge. And you're not choosing good and bad ideas, right? And part of what's exciting for me is in the next couple months, Harvard's going to bring online the Facebook files. And if you want to go read that research paper, you can, right? And I think that's really going to change the debate. But the only way Facebook is going to use tools like that is if there is a countervailing force. Like if they have to actually give us data on what they're choosing to distribute, on what they're choosing to take down, unless we can see these things, they're not going to have the incentives to lose that tiny little fraction of a percentage of profit by choosing the safer path forward.
The other thing that's happening in Canada, or has been over the last year, is the companies, the platforms themselves have been ramping up their efforts.
They're lobbying, yeah.
And so why do they care so much about Canada? And if we're just trying to pass something that's the same as Europe, why do they care about us doing something similar?
I think they're super scared. Well, one, it's easier for them to do that here than it is to do in Europe because every lobbyist at Facebook, no matter their territory, speaks English because they have to be able to interface with Menlo Park. But and not every lobbyist speaks Latvian or Polish, right? There's a certain asymmetry there. But the second is they're really, really scared that if something passes in Canada, it will look reasonable to American eyes, right? Something passing in Europe, well, that's European. Europeans do things. They also like eat at funny hours and, walk places. Though you guys have mass transit here too. I think there's a real thing of if Canada can pass it, that it feels like a feasible thing. It feels like that is a path forward. And I want you to know quite clearly, the top big tech lobbyist in DC last year was Facebook. They spent more than any other big tech company. And it's because they're afraid. They know we are approaching the line of action. And they want to make people believe nothing is possible because they're buying as much time as they can.
Okay, I want to go to the audience in a minute, but a couple of last things that are present in the Canadian debate at the moment, and I'd love to know what you think of them. Chinese interference is a major issue in Canada at the moment. We have seen pretty widespread attempts by the Chinese government to influence democratic elections. Some of that has been on platforms. There is growing concern about TikTok and the role it's playing, not just on kids, but just as a potential space that could be manipulated by a foreign power. How should we be thinking about the Chinese government in this whole conversation? Is it the same conversation or is it a different one?
So let's do a little check-in on what is TikTok, right? Like I think a lot of people, when they think of TikTok, they think of frivolous things. They're like, oh, that's funny dances. That's like viral videos, stunts. More and more people are getting their news from TikTok. So when we poll people under the age of 35, and I want to be clear, some of it is actually decent coverage. Before you're like, well, I don't know about that news on TikTok thing. Like people will do things like they'll show a headline and then they'll do commentary for a minute. Right? I'm actually thinking about starting to do this to explain news stories that are happening around social media. When you look at people under the age of 35, every single year, the fraction of the population that gets their news from TikTok goes up. Do you want a company that is owned by, like that is actively governed by interests in China? Do you want that company running your news ecosystem? That seems crazy to me. If there's any kind of conflict with China, we should expect that the Chinese government will influence what is and isn't distributed on TikTok. The second thing is TikTok is structured differently than Facebook is. So Facebook has a social network. You know, you have real family and friends. TikTok is designed to intentionally push things hyper-viral, because then a few thousand pieces of content globally can make up, say, 80% of everything that's viewed. When you push that kind of, when you constrict what content is being distributed and give it a few things more distribution, you can manually screen that content. And there have been major scandals in the last few years on things like if you were visibly gay or if you were visibly disabled, they wouldn't put you on the For You page. They wouldn't recommend you to other people. They wouldn't let you go viral. And it was to protect you from being bullied. I don't think that's actually why, but you know, I'm not sitting inside of boardrooms. We've had multiple whistleblowers come forward in the last couple of years saying the current CEO who sits in Singapore, he doesn't make the major decisions in the company. Executives who sit in Beijing make those decisions. And I think we have to have conversations around divestment, because we have a precedent, at least in the United States, that for critical industries that have a national security component, and our information environment has a national security component, that we have forced divestment and we have forced swapping out, say, senior and mid-level management. And it doesn't have to be just, you know, an American company. We can have a multilateral kind of approach on it. But I don't think a company that has that level of control from China should be running a major portion of our information environment.
What is TikTok in China? Can you explain a little bit about how different it is?
Oh,
or
sure.
The Chinese version of
TikTok? So to give you some context also, in China, TikTok is acknowledged to be habit-forming enough that kids are only allowed to use so if you're under the age of 18, so this is not a 13-year-old cutoff, this is an under 18 cutoff, you at most can use 40 minutes a day. You get shown different content, stuff that promotes, you know, science, medicine, engineering type careers, that's informative, that's educational. You know, when you poll kids today in the United States, the top career that people want, like kids want when they grow up, is to be a social media influencer, right? And in China, it's an astronaut. Part of that is the information environment. And we have to have those kinds of conversations.
And that kind of example.
Oh, and actually, it's interesting. When they asked at the Senate hearing, they asked the CEO, like, why is it so different? And he said, it's because China has different laws.
Right. I mean, they're also an autocratic state.
That too.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is part of.
They're technically laws, just to be sure.
Sure, they are technically laws. But that kind of example, combined with the harms we know and see, particularly the kids of some of these technologies, have led democratic countries to illiberal solutions.
Yes.
So that's what Utah and Montana are doing.
Yes, that's what they're doing.
So they're
that's
imposing similar,
yeah.
we're not use autocratic, but illiberal policies. How do we ensure that we have the right sort of moderation when we're talking about this space? And
sure.
ensure the democratic principles are sort of central.
So So one of the things I talk about in my book is the idea of I think a framework that you can think about is you know, what if we were designing to maximize autonomy and dignity? Right? Like, what if we came and we said, you know, you can ask, are we giving you more choices or fewer choices? Like, what if you took it from that framework? And I'll give you an example of like an autocratic solution versus like a solution that is trying to optimize for autonomy and dignity. So in China, you can't use it after, if you're under 18, you can't use TikTok after 10 p.m. Part of the reason for that, I'll give you a contrast. So part of why the Surgeon General did his announcement last week was if you use social media for more than 3 hours a day, and you are under the age of 18, you have a much, much, much higher chance of being depressed, right? It's a huge risk factor. The average child in the United States uses social media for 3.5 hours a day. 30% of kids are saying, I use social media until midnight or later most weeknights. Right, that's a big deal. It's one of the top risk factors for mental health issues. It's one of the top issues for all-cause mortality. Kids get more accidents, not just automotive, just accidents in general. Increases substance use, uppers because kids are tired, downers because they're crabby. Right, it's a big deal. The autocratic solution is to come in and say, you can't use it after 10 p.m. If you wanted another way you could approach that, though, is imagine if at 10 a.m., when that kid shows up all hungover from me on Instagram at 2 o'clock, they're sitting in math class and a little thing pops up saying, when do you want to go to bed tonight? Kid's like 11. My mom wants me to go to bed at 10. I want to go to bed at 11. And for 2 hours before that, Instagram got a little bit slower and a little bit slower and a little bit slower. And we've known for 20 years that if you make software a little bit slower, like milliseconds slower, people use it less. Imagine as they got to their bedtime, they just got tired, a little bored, went to bed. That's a solution that prioritizes making choices, like giving people real choices. Because when you're up doom scrolling at 11 o'clock at night, midnight, you're dissociating. Like we've run studies where people insert into people's Instagram feeds like random content. If you're just doom scrolling, you're not actually engaging. That's about giving people choices. And I think that's a way you can think about what kinds of regulations are we doing. If we do a transparency law, a risk-based law, that's about giving people information so they get to make real choices. That's different than coming and saying, we're going to ban all of TikTok in one day.
Okay, last question, then I hands it after this. The other thing that's happening here, which is happening in other countries around the world right now, is that AI has become the flashy object. So the heads of the companies that are deploying AI, whether it's Sam Altman or are traveling around the world, doing essentially the same thing that social media companies did 10 years ago, which is, we want to be regulated, but you dumb governments can't possibly understand how complicated we are, certainly don't do it the way you're saying you're going to do it.
Yeah.
Are we worried about that being a distraction? Like, is that a distraction, or is it a different conversation?
I don't think that's what Sam Altman's doing, though. Like, Sam Altman has come in and said things like there should be licenses. Like, there needs to be a licensing-based approach. Because right now, because there's a very similar thing happening with AGI right now, right? That if you are responsible, and like OpenAI has done more effort on what's known as alignment, that's trying to make sure the AI is serving the best interests of people. Of any of the big companies, like Facebook open sourced their AI, which is, I think, incredibly, incredibly irresponsible after finding their AI safety team, right? And it's the year of efficiency, so I mean, he had to do it, right? But Sam Altman came and said, hey, we have to have a licensing scheme where, like, if you don't play by the rules of the road, you can't operate, because he's facing the same kind of thing that the social media companies are, where the first social media company to come in and say, hey, we're actually not going to let under 13-year-olds on our site. Like, we've seen the research, 10 to 14 is like the danger zone, because kids are going through puberty, their brains change, there's a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to actually enforce under 13. That's the first company that gives up on the next generation. Right? The first company that comes in and says, we know this is habit forming, we're going to give you tools to go to bed, is the first company people are like, oh, so you have the dangerous social media. And so I hope they do take some kind of licensing approach. But I do agree they're not guiding people on as much.
But I guess more broadly what I'm concerned about is we're already moving on from the social media conversation.
Yeah.
So we've spent a number of years, and in part because of the conversation you spurred, thinking about how we might solve this particular problem, the social media problem. And all of a sudden, when we're about to implement these policies around the world, we have this big thing called AI that people can't define, that there's lots of scary attributes to. It also could save the planet, so on and so forth. But you governments can't possibly regulate it. Is that a distraction, or can we be worried about both at the same time, or how do we think about that?
I worry that more and more people who... So one of the key challenges of social media is, if you talk to the random person in Menlo Park who works at Facebook, their experience of Facebook is not a representative experience of Facebook, because disproportionately the people who work in that office went to an Ivy League college. The people they interacted with on Facebook went to Ivy League schools. There's very little violence. There's very little cussing. Everyone's very civil. It's very country clubby. They're like, how could this be a bad thing? They don't see what it looks like in an African country where none of the AI safety systems were written for that language. They don't see what it looks like in a place that has ethnic violence, how that impacts things. And I think when it comes to the AGI things, we are going to feel the costs so fast. Like, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are going to go away very, very fast. And it's going to hit middle class and upper middle class people, I think, harder than a lot of working class jobs. And I think the fact that that pain is so asymmetric is going to drive action on AI. In a way it didn't. But I think in terms of action, I think the kids being harmed thing is going to be the linchpin. Like, we are going to see something happen in the next 5 years, because how many of you have grandkids? How many of you have kids, right? Like, or who are under 18, right? A lot of people are being impacted.
It affects enough people.
And I think the thing that scares me the most is if you try to find the suicide rate for under 18-year-olds in the United States, the most recent live data I can see is from 5 years ago. And last year, it was for 5 years before that. I think they delayed the data. And those graphs are hockey sticks, right? It's terrifying. And so I think it's just one of these things where we are facing a crisis, and the crisis is going to get way worse every year until something happens.
So it's that urgency is not going away, even if AI is distracting us a little bit, or me anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, you have small children, right? You don't have teenagers.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah.
All right. Questions? Who has one?
Yeah. This is not going to be a story, but as a bit of background, there's a career you can have in law or accounting, engineering, where you're part of a team that tries to regulate, try to hold a regulated monopoly utility to its regulations. And I was on such a team once, and every member of the team had their money in utilities because they knew their job was impossible. That the utility is regulated at 6%, generally makes about 8% by brilliantly and creatively inflating its costs so they can inflate their profits. And if the team can hold them down to 7.5%, well, on $1 billion a year of billings, that's $50 million saved for the public, and it pays for the $5 million legal team. So it's a permanent job. They do it for 30 years and retire. And you can't regulate a monopoly. Not successfully, not really. You can hold them down to a dull roar, but you can't ever really stop. They're brilliant, they're creative, and they're relentless. Can we regulate social media as long as it's run by monopolies? They have to be programmed.
So the challenge is, just like power companies. So I think solar is actually a really interesting thing. Because solar is the first thing where, like, you can actually begin to challenge the network effects of, like, a power monopoly, right? Like, if you want to have solar panels on your house, now that we have, like, good battery storage, if you live in many climates, maybe not the Pacific Northwest, because you guys have some cloudy seasons, you can opt out, right? Social media, because it is a network effect-based system, I have never seen a plausible proposal for interoperability, which is how you would actually break up social media, that sounded plausible. So I'll give you an example. People are like, but email works. Like, email's a network. Like, it's interoperable. Email hasn't changed in 20 years. Like, you're basically saying we're going to freeze the feature set where we are today and we're not going to change. And it's actually a huge problem. Like there's a lot of very reasonable features like undo send that would be lovely to have in the larger world. And we can't do it because there's too many email clients out there. Even things like they're trying to do interoperability on messaging, and it's becoming a huge problem because I personally, my primary messenger is encrypted. So I use something called Signal. I don't want my messages sent to WhatsApp. Like I don't use WhatsApp intentionally, right? Like it would require compromising the security profile to have that as interoperability. So it becomes this thing where I think we have no other option but to regulate because we can't, in an effective way, break up these social media companies. Or I'll give you another example. What does it mean to make Twitter and TikTok interoperable? Does that mean I get to put videos in my Twitter feed, or does it mean I get to have text in the TikTok feed, right? Like, there's a lot of these questions also. I do think there are huge opportunities for steps forward with even very basic laws. So every other industry is kept safe by what I call the ecosystem of accountability. So that means you have lawyers that know what a cut corner looks like, and they go find the victims and they hold people accountable. It's legislative aids that know what's possible with regulations. It's investors that want to manage long-term risk, and they invest accordingly, or they coach companies accordingly to drive down that risk. It's concerned citizens that keep the issue at the forefront over long periods of time, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Right now, almost every part of that ecosystem of accountability is missing when it comes to social media because we can't grade their homework. The only successful boycott we've had so far on social media is called Stop Hate for Profit. They got a whole bunch of major advertisers to pull out. This was in 2020 during Black Lives Matter. It lasted for about a month, and then Facebook came out and said, we solved hate speech. We took down all these pages, we took down all these groups, we solved hate speech. You can advertise again. And because there was no independent yardstick, they couldn't say, hey, no, we demanded this amount of improvement and we haven't seen it. And I think there's a real opportunity where once you peel back the curtain, once you have something kind of like the DSA where you say, hey, you're gonna have public data, there's a bunch of data you're gonna have publicly, suddenly you can actually begin organizing. You can have divestment from pension funds, and divestment from endowments. You can begin to use the levers of accountability, but you can't do that if you don't have transparency.
There's also the monopoly debate often just falls on this: should we break them up or not? And sort of this very American sort of framing of competition policy. But there's all sorts of other things you can do to force markets to be more competitive, short of breaking up monopolies. So the UK, for example, the competition authority in the UK has forced Facebook to divest their purchasing or reverse their purchasing of Giphy.
Oh yes,
right?
Giphy. Yeah.
So this is kind of interesting. This is one competition authority in one country has forced Facebook to now sell this thing they bought a year ago.
At a huge loss.
At a huge loss.
Yeah.
And any country could force a reversal of mergers and acquisitions. And that's actually starting to happen in the US now, where there's so much scrutiny on acquisitions that these companies aren't really buying companies anymore in the same way they were before, because they know they're going to come under so much scrutiny. So you can kind of stop them from getting bigger too, and from expanding their monopolies. So there are a lot of things you can do.
And the secondary thing too is many of you may not be aware of this, but big tech companies, it's very hard for them to get high quality leadership except by buying companies, right? That when people are assessing where do I want to go work, the people who are going to introduce new dynamicism. I have a little bit of a speech impediment. Dynamism. Make these companies vibrant, have them be on the cutting edge. Almost all of those leaders come in through an acquisition. They're bought, right? They found a company. They show I can do this cool thing. They get bought in for a sum of money they could never justify just hiring an employee. And now you have this really vibrant leader, and they end up becoming a senior executive. And once you stop allowing them to buy, you also choke them off in another way.
You force them to innovate, creating metaverses internally.
That was a branding exercise.
Okay, there's a question in the middle here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. Earlier you mentioned that a lot of experiments incentivize profit and harm reduction. And in 2018, Facebook had an oversight board created. So I wonder if any of those trainings ever make it to an oversight board?
Let's discuss the oversight board.
Was that ever effective in your opinion?
So I guess this is actually, I'm going to throw a question back at you. What are the responsibilities of the oversight board? Like just like based on what you know or what you think you know. I'm going to pull other people, so have your answer in mind, folks. What do you think they do?
I always thought it was to balance profit first mindset with social responsibility, like social corporate responsibility.
Cool. Does anyone else have a theory? Anyone? Anyone know what the oversight board is?
Explain what the oversight board is quickly.
Oh yeah, so no. So we're just going off the name right now.
Okay.
So you either know what it is or you're going to guess what it does. Okay, what do you think?
To divert responsibility from Mark Zuckerberg?
Okay, actually no, there is a little bit of that. Anyone else? Come on, you can have theories. Yeah, no bad answers.
I thought they were like in charge of governing disputes over like offensive content from like the entire world.
Great, so that's the closest one. So the name sounds like, part of the reason I was like, I don't care, tell me what you think they do, is because the name sounds like what you thought it was, right? It sounds like the oversight board is to provide oversight to Facebook, right? You imagine a lot of different ways they might provide oversight. The entire scope of what they are is if you get your content taken down by Facebook and you object, you can write to them and say, I object. The oversight board can choose to hear your thing, though in the last 5 years, they've seen a tiny number of cases. I think they average about 20 to 30 a year. And they'll put your content back up. They don't even redistribute it, they just put it up. They cannot ask how effectively the content moderation systems as a whole work. They can't ask who even has language coverage. They can't ask how effective these systems are. And Facebook has given them $250 million in an endowment to do this work. Like they've gotten some incredible people who I think have their hearts in the right place to sit and be on these juries. And it sure looks like they have an oversight board, but the oversight board does not act in any real means as an oversight.
Part of the idea is to set precedent, right? So the idea
No,
is,
actually, that was not technically part of it.
that's how it gets framed.
It's
like,
framed. It's like,
yeah.
we can learn from this,
Right.
but none of it's binding.
Right, so that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Has there been cases where these individual tough
Sure.
decisions
Yeah.
have then been adopted by Facebook
So
and expanded to the system?
I'll give an example. So back when Trump got taken down, right? So this is right after January 6th. And they were like, hey, we noticed you said he had been covered by this policy called cross-check, right? So cross-check is a way of it. There's what Facebook said it was. So back in 2018, they put and when the oversight board asked us, they said, hey, you said the reason why his stuff was getting distributed was he was protected by cross-check. What is this cross-check thing? Please explain. And Facebook came back and responded to the oversight board and said, we already wrote about it. Here's a blog post from 2018. And what it says is, hey, sometimes for really prominent people, when we think your content is violating, we have another person look at it just to be sure. Because if we took down something that was innocuous, then we'd have egg on our face. In reality, the program full-on whitelisted a lot of people. That for many safety systems, they didn't want to allocate the money to have a second check, so they just let you pass. Like if you were enough of a VIP, and about 5 million people in the world were, they just opened the gate and you got to pass. Because then they didn't have to pay money for that second check. And understandably, the oversight board was very mad when my disclosures came out, because all of that came to light for the first time. And so the oversight board suggested about 30 ways that program should change. So things like, you should tell us who's in the program. Right? Seems kind of obvious. You say that everyone's equal, well, at least tell us who's equal, right? Or you should let people request to be in the program if they're not, right? Just make it a little more equal access. You should tell us, you should have a repository of what content got protected so we can, hold it accountable. A bunch of these things. They had about 30 suggestions. Facebook did less than half of them. Right? And so even on really big issues, Facebook, they'll take the advice, but they do what they want to do.
Any questions? Yeah.
You spoke a lot about different media companies, but I haven't heard you say anything about Twitter. I'm still on Facebook because so many of my friends of my generation are on there. It's the easiest way to reach them. Twitter dropped because within a week of a certain person buying it, I started getting racist stuff in my feed.
Yeah, I believe that.
Any comments on how and why that's happening?
Also there's other, like, Twitter's like fallen apart. Like, I learned a fun fact from Jack Dorsey, which was there's like a full minute of lag now on things being distributed on Twitter. Like, it used to be you posted something, it got distributed, right? Like, Twitter is creaking. And Elon, I try to give Elon credit for things Elon has done, because there's certain things that no one has done but Elon so far. So Elon published the algorithm that he claims they use. We don't know for sure, because, like, we don't have laws that require them to tell the truth on it. And we don't have any data on the performance of that system, which is important because even people who design them don't necessarily know. But he did a really big thing. Like, I want to be clear, he didn't just publish it, he published the entire revision history of it. And for any of you who write code, all code starts out really ugly. So, like, showing your version from 5 years ago is like, that is an act of bravery, in my opinion. And so we need to see more of those kinds of transparency actions. He's done some other things that I'm really upset about. Like, there used to be a free version of their API so that you could get data if you were a researcher. And because they're trying to find every little avenue to monetize, they now charge for that, and a lot of academics can't afford it anymore.
$42,000 a month.
It's $42,000 a month.
We use it, and we can't afford it. And not only that, they're saying that if you don't subscribe to the $42,000, you have to delete the previous data that you purchased from. Yeah.
Oh, brutal. Yeah. So for context, the reason why this is so important is when I worked at Facebook, the information operations teams, this is the people who are catching, like, Russian info warfare kind of stuff, they regularly caught information operations on Facebook from Twitter data, right? Because academics could get Twitter data and they couldn't get Facebook data, they would find these networks and they would go, oh, interesting, and then they would see the same names and the same accounts interacting with each other on Facebook, and they would tell Facebook. Or Twitter would they tell Twitter, and Twitter would look up the IP addresses and send the IP addresses to Facebook, and they'd find the same ones. So, like, Elon made everyone less safe by, like, that action, and by not having exceptions.
So what's going to happen with them on the governance front? So he's just pulled out of the code of practice of disinformation, which was this voluntary code in the UK, in Europe, that all the platforms signed up to. Yeah. But it's about to become mandatory when the Digital Services Act comes into effect.
In August.
Yeah. So is he just going to leave Europe, or is he going to? What's going to happen?
I think it'll be fascinating. Yeah, Elon has this tendency where, like, he thinks he's, like, exempt from things, and in reality, he is not exempt. I think it'll be really interesting to see how it goes, because, like, I bet he has. So just for context for people, Twitter has a very different user profile base than Facebook does. So Facebook, like, a huge part of why I came forward was Facebook knew that the company that would come and eat its lunch was probably going to come from a place where Facebook was not dominant, like, just in terms of the history of how these things work. And back in 2011, when I worked on Google+, there were still countries in the world where the dominant social network was not Facebook. You know, Korea had one, before Google killed Orkut, Brazil had one. There were places, or like even India, that had a huge Orkut percentage. And Facebook said, we don't want anyone to innovate. Like, we want to get there and get those network effects locked in real early. And so they went around the world and said, hey, right now data costs $65 a gigabyte for you to access it on your phone. The monthly earnings in this country is a couple $100. If you want free data, you can use Facebook. If you want to use anything else, you're going to pay for it yourself. And so for many, many countries in the world, if you poll people and say, do you use the internet? Do you use Facebook? There's a 10% margin more people who say I use Facebook than say I use the internet, because they don't know they're using the internet. Right? Think about that for a moment. And where did the Facebook killer come from? Like, the first thing to compete with it came from China, the only place where Facebook can play. In terms of if Facebook cut off Europe, it would cut off a lot of users, but it would not cut off 30% of their users, 40% of their users. I bet if you cut off Europe, you would lose at least 25% or 30% of Twitter. Yeah, it would be a big deal. And so I assume he's not going to be willing to do that. But I bet he didn't have lawyers who could advise him on it.
They fired their policy team.
Yeah, they did. They fired their policy team.
Yeah.
They have Europe run the policy team, so we're set.
Question up here?
Okay, this is my unrealistic idea. I know what you're talking about. It is. Okay.
That's how we iterate.
Libraries have, in the US, 175 million users. If library had an open source social media of all verified users, what, and I know it's impossible to get people to move from one platform, they're very sticky, but what is the biggest issue you see with that idea?
So I question you on the it's possible to get people to move thing. Because I don't know, does Nextdoor operate in Canada? Yeah. I live in Puerto Rico and I can't use Nextdoor because Nextdoor is not in Puerto Rico. But I'm shocked at how many people use Nextdoor. And Nextdoor didn't exist really 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So there might be, I think there's an interesting public option space where in some countries they have invested in a public option. I think the question around that is to ask the question of what is different? And one of the things that I talk to people a lot about is this idea of people like to influence things they care about. We have school boards in the United States. I assume you guys have school boards in Canada? Yeah. Sorry, I'm learning. I'm a new Canadian, I'm working on it.
Way up north, we have school boards.
I just don't know. Well, I don't know. Every place runs education very, very differently. The French run it way differently in the United States, that kind of thing. But the people like to influence things they care about. And we have these democratic institutions because people want a say. They want a say on the pothole gets filled. They want to have consequences. And we have been told that we are lucky that we don't pay for social media, right? That we've been given this gift, this free thing, and that's what we should care about. And I think if people were educated on, what if you had a thing that you owned? What if you had a thing where, you have to do a little bit of jury duty, i.e. you have to moderate a little content once in a while, or you have to answer poll questions and things so that we can have more democratic accountability on it. Maybe you have to chip in $1 a month or something. But if you could have also influence on that system, how would you weigh that trade-off? And I think that's going to be another one of these conversations that we have more and more over the next 5 years.
Is there any last question, or Jorge, do you want to? Sorry. Yes, good to see you. Yeah.
I've been quite concerned about the fact that I don't use Facebook or Twitter myself because I'm a bit paranoid about privacy. But I've seen, of course, many people rely on it, and the kids rely on it. And I'm quite concerned now with AI coming in and gradually becoming incorporated into it, that people's real histories are going to be a product of these companies that will be able to use this information in ways that could be harmful, but that the people whose information is being used have absolutely no say. Clue. And I'm wondering, now that AI is really starting to become a reality in different means, do you think that laws will change so that people will have a little bit more say in what happens to that product with social media?
I think there's a real opportunity around, and this is part of why I'm working with McGill this year, right? Is I really believe in the democratic process. And the democratic process is about conversations, right? And we used to have an information environment that was run by newspapers and other kind of classical news organizations. And now a huge fraction of that information environment is moderated by algorithms, right? And I think there's a thing of, people aren't aware of what should your Bill of Rights be, right? I'll give you an example. Right now, you don't have the right to reset an algorithm about you without losing your whole account, right? You can reset that algorithm. You can give up your history. You have to choose between your future and your past. You don't have that, and I think it's one of these things where if people knew, hey, why don't you have that right? Why don't platforms do it? They don't do it because you'll use the product less. Like right now, it's hyper-tuned to you. They will lose probably a couple percentage points on your account when it resets, because they'll use it less. As they're relearning who you are. But like I lived through an experience where I'm lucky that I wasn't harmed more. Where I had to relearn to walk. Like I got sick enough in my late 20s. I must have watched a lot of depressing Netflix content for a couple of years. Because at some point I got healthy enough that I was like, wow, Netflix is really depressing. Right? Every time I'd open up Netflix, it'd be like all dark documentaries and like dramas and like, wow, like the world is gloomy. And I moved in with some new people. And it didn't matter that I would intentionally go and like try to search for comedies. I'd try to do stuff. I just like couldn't make Netflix work for me. And I moved in with some new people, and they had their own Netflix account. I was like, wow, Netflix is wonderful. There's like all this great stuff on Netflix. And I didn't have the ability to like, reset my account without losing all my reviews, right? And right now we have kids who have mental health issues. They have eating disorders. They're feeling depressed. Who have to choose between giving up all their friends and all their posts documenting their childhood and an algorithm that is safe for them, right? We have the things where we could be changing those, and I think that's like how we're going to move we have to educate people that there are options, and then we have to demand those.
And I'm concerned too that there's a whole generation right now that doesn't really understand the concept of personal privacy. Mm-hmm. And what is that loss going to be when I think it can lead to a great amount of cynicism and apathy and a lessening of the sense that they count, that they're important.
I think there's like a complementary side of that coin, which I think has even faster consequences, which is you have a whole generation of kids who think they have to be performers. Yeah. Right? That like when you have a social media account and you're like, every time you post, you're like, do enough people like my post? Now you are constructing an identity on very concrete data of like how much feedback did I get. And I think that I completely agree with you that we are losing the idea that people can exist in not on a stage and still be happy.
Look, thank you, Frances. And look, we're heading into this year where we're going to have a big debate in this country, I think, about exactly these issues. And I'm just so glad you're participating in it with us over the next year.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Bringing your optimism to how we can actually solve these problems. It's not all gloomy.
Can
it's
we
positive.
Can I give
I was just going to yell at Frances.
Oh yeah.
Tell us the Germany story.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So I spent a lot of time sitting in rooms watching people look sadder and sadder over the course of the time I talk, and it hurts me. And so I've learned that we need to end on a happy note. So it's okay to feel overwhelmed right now. Right, it's a very rational, reasonable response to be like, wow, this is really overwhelming. But the thing is, this is not new. Every single time we have invented a new communication technology before, it's been really disruptive, right? Our information environment changes our perceptions of reality. It changes the connections. It changes how we all operate. And it takes time for us to realize that and respond. So when we first invented the printing press, we had things like people started printing cheap pamphlets. When we talk about people doing things like burning their neighbors as witches, that's because people were publishing pamphlets being like, how do you find the witches among you, right? Like misinformation was harmful. When we invented the cheap printing press, we had the same thing against some newspapers. We had whole wars fought over misinformation, but we responded. We started having things like journalistic ethics, journalism schools, media concentration rules, transparency laws on you to tell us if you own all the papers. When we invented things like the telegraph even, it was disruptive. Like the telegraph did not cause the Civil War, but historians believe it influenced when the Civil War was, because for the first time, people could tell that people who lived far away from them didn't agree with them. You could tell a story about we're all one nation, we believe the same thing, if you have no countering data. Before World War II, the rise of things like radio gave people personal relationships with their leaders. You could hear their voice, you could feel their energy. And historians know that led to the rise of dictators in World War II.
This is your optimism note?
No, but we responded. right? We learned about things, again, like media transparency. We invested in public media. We every single time before, we have figured out different ways to work and live with these technologies. And we have been, yes, we've been changed by them, but we have also changed them back. And the reason why it feels overwhelming now is you're living through it. You know, it's easy to look back in time and be like, newspapers, you know, we know how to deal with newspapers. We figured this out. Radio, TV, we figured out how to deal with this. We have to figure out how we're going to live with social media. And while it may get much worse before it gets better, every single time before, we have successfully responded. And I have full faith that we are going to do it again.
All right, well done.
Frances, Taylor, thank you so much.